process where you're going to see this is in the implementation of policies. We normally think of implementation of policies, think of the public health or the healthcare system signed into law by Obama. We normally think of policies as a matter of decision making. You know, there's a lot of debate in the Senate, and there's a lot of debate in Congress, and finally they agreed and they take a vote, and they say, yes, we're going to approve this new law for the revitalization of our cities. Okay, well, it goes to the Senate, they approve it, and finally gets to the executive desk of the president. The president, in a big ceremony with cameras and everything, signs the Revitalization of Cities Act, right? And we think that that was the end of the matter. All the debate, well, yes, all the debate, but now it's finally law. Well, think again. When a law is signed, that is the beginning of the problem. Because now you're going to have to start thinking about how you're going to implement that law, right? The very first thing to decide is, well, this is a healthcare law. So which organizations operating at a federal level need to be involved? Well, the Food and Drug Administration is going to have to be involved because drugs, medicines, are involved. But also the Environmental Protection Agency needs to be involved because we're going to need to know about the effect of asbestos and the effect of pollution on kids' lungs and so on. And so you start numbering the number of agencies that want a piece of the pie, that want a piece of the budget, right? And of course, each one of those agencies is going to want a piece of the pie that's as big as they can get, regardless of their merits, regardless of the rationality of the action, right? So there's going to be infighting already at the federal level. Then each one of those agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on and so forth, is going to have to call on its state-level counterparts, you know, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of Utah, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of New York, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of Philadelphia, of Pennsylvania, and so on, one state at a time, saying, guys, you're going to have to play ball, you have to join in, but of course each one of them is going to add one veto point, right? Because each one of them can then say, yes, we agree with everything except the individual mandate. For instance, in this particular case, remember the individual mandate is by 2014, people without insurance are forced to buy insurance, which is one big thing right now about the Tea Party. They hate that, right? So one agency among many states might just decide, yes, but we don't like that individual mandate. And because they've introduced one more veto point, now there's one more obstacle to the implementation of the policy. And even if there was not that, each one of those state agencies now have to rally every single city in the state and the local agencies of every single city, because those are the ones who eventually are going to have to dispense the money. Those are the ones who are going to have to build the new hospitals. Those are the ones who are going to have to train new doctors. Those are the ones who are going to actually implement the policy. Right? And because it takes time to do all this, it can take years for all these little conflicts to be resolved, there's plenty of time for other organizations to sneak themselves in and to say, hey, wait a minute, this touches upon my territory a little bit. Not a lot, but enough that I should get a little chunk of the change there. You have plenty of time for the policy to become distorted by special interests at each one of the levels, federal, state, or local. And the problem with this, and you can read this there's a series of books on implementation. I don't remember the author right now, but you can find him in Amazon just by typing the word implementation, is that studies of the implementation of federal policies that have followed the implementation process year after year, all the way to 10 or 15 years when it's finally finished, show how distorted the policy becomes as this process of implementation goes on. Now, why is this important? Because we tend to, theoretically now, at the level of theory, call this thing, this assemblage of organizations, this complex assemblage of organizations, we tend to call it the state, which is fine because we need to give words to things. But when a word connotes too much of a monolithic structure, and the word the state connotes that, right? Just let the state decide, or let the market decide. And you start opposing the market to the state as if they were two monolithic entities, right? Then you forget about the complexity of implementation. because you forget that a federal government is an ecology of organizations, some of which are warring against each other, some of which have turf disputes, some of which have jurisdictional overlappings that cause friction on a day-to-day operation. So if we're going to be realistic about government policies that implement new things or that change society for the better, we need to take into account that it is a complex assemblage of many organizations. Remember that in the past, we have not thought that way. And I don't want to start attacking Marxism right now, but Marxists had a conception of the state that was relatively monolithic. Relatively, say right now, because you cannot generalize over every Marxist. Trotsky was different than Lenin. Lenin was different than Marx. Marx was different than Engels. All of whom were different than Gramsci and Rosa Luxemburgo, and so on and so forth. But they had a relatively monolithic theory of the state, and therefore they thought that socialist planning was in fact relatively simple. I mean, relative to the anarchy of the market, as Marx used to call it, where millions of decisions independently made supposedly create prices that self-organize and so on, but lead the capitalism to crisis after crisis. If the government plans everything over a 5-year cycle, well, there has to be a lot more order in a country. Well, yes, if the state was monolithic, if decisions made by government were implemented exactly the way in which this 5-year plan said they would be implemented, but once you begin to think that over 5 years, those decisions are going to get entirely distorted, then you begin to distrust central planning. You begin to realize that central planning cannot possibly be the solution because it doesn't even work in countries like the United States, which are supposedly functional, let alone third world countries, which are very dysfunctional, and in which, in many cases, the office and the incumbent are not separated. That's one source of corruption, right? When the incumbent of an office can actually dispose of the resources of that office at will, and so get bribes in order to give those resources in a particular direction. But even in the absence of corruption, the very complexity of this assemblage shows you that implementation needs to be thought carefully. It needs to be thought as a process that is full of friction and full of potential accidental and contingent events that might, derail it.